Greetings all. I hope that your weekend has been fantastic. Personally, I got hit with a lot of unexpected deadlines this week, some updates to faculty paperwork and whatnot. And so I decided to do the only logical thing, which was to focus on making a Punctibyte instead because it sounded like far more fun. So here we are, and I'd like to welcome you to this week of the 28th of October, and it's amazing how fast November is rearing its ugly head, and that was part of my problem. But we are headed into advising week this week, so if you haven't managed to connect with your advisor, make sure you do get to do that. This Friday, Kelly, Sydney, and Jesse will be meeting me for Open Lab, and during the week we're going to be doing Labs 18 and Labs 19, which I'm super jazzed to be really getting into the heart of the unknown identification, especially with the changes that we've been making, which are just so invigorating to me. And so that's part of what I want to talk about today. The other thing that I did want to note is that actually Friday is November 1st, and you may want to make note to your students that November 1st is the last day to withdraw. So if you're worried about some of your students, they haven't submitted a lot of assignments, they've missed many labs, we need to make sure that they're aware of that for that last day to withdraw. I also wanted to just bring your attention to the fact that next week will be our third lecture exam. So a lot of the students may be asking you questions about designing their posters. They are allowed to use a poster for that lecture exam. And so I'm sure all of you have already been doing a great job of helping them out in that journey. So let's go ahead and talk about a few things, beginning with looking at Lab 18, and then we'll talk about some of the new things, the new rubric that I've created to help us to grade the new assignment for the 10 points that we mentioned towards their practical, what would have been their practical exam score. And then at the end of the Punctibyte, I want you to stay around because I'm going to talk about teaching philosophies and a little bit about pedagogy. So hopefully at this point in the game, all of you have really started to establish your own ideas of teaching, and I'm hoping that this will help you further evolve those underpinning philosophies that you take into the classroom. So without further ado, let's look at the TA guideline for Lab 18. And you'll notice that I've got quite a few things highlighted on here. This is a pretty straightforward lecture because we're largely going to be telling the students how to make a reserve and a working stock. It also, however, does encompass winemaking. So we've talked a lot in lecture about metabolism, and the winemaking should fit in really slickly into that mode. But it will also be important to spend a little time studying if you are giving that winemaking portion of the lecture because it's so fun to give. You'll want to do a really good job of it. If you're not really feeling equipped for that section, please feel free to hand over the lecture to me at that point, and I'll talk to them about winemaking and relate it to our discussion of metabolism in lecture. So one note with the unknown reserve and working stocks, a couple of important things. One of the things that the students get confused by is why we keep doing gram stains. And they think, gosh, we've already gram stained this thing. Don't we already know it's gram positive or gram negative? Yeah, we do. But what we don't know is whether or not it's pure. And we also like to watch how the morphology of the cells may vary or differ. And so we're always establishing and reestablishing purity with those gram stains. And that's something really important to speak with the students about. And that's also the reason we want to make sure that we're identifying one pure isolate, and that's why we also use a half a colony for the reserve stock, a half a colony for the working stock, and then that way we know we're identifying the exact same thing. One of the common requests that you'll get is, well, if my reserve stock didn't grow or my working stock didn't grow, can't I just go back to my plate and use colonies off of my plate? And the answer to that is no, because we won't be assured that we're getting the same isolate, that we want to be able to identify that one single pure culture, and that's what we want to work with for the entire identification. The other thing that I would like for you to think about doing during Lab 18 is going around and speaking with them about the data tables that they're finding in Lab 18 and how we are going to require them to fill those out in their lab manual. This is something very important and a good place for us to remind them of good etiquette for lab notebook maintenance. So keeping on top of those tables and writing the entries as is described in the assignment description. So turn their attention to that assignment description right before the data tables and make sure that they're doing a good job of making the correct entries, because their tendency will be to want to make entries that are simply about what the unknown, what their unknown did, and not to put in full information about the biochemical test. So those are our goals for Lab 18. Lab 19, we have some additional goals, and that is we are going to be collecting that assignment. And you'll notice I've added in here that the ID plan, or the identification plan, is another part of that assignment, new now, and I have created a rubric for that. There's a couple of other little things that I mentioned for Lab 19. Make sure you get a rack for your MRVP tubes and get that labeled separately. Those need to go into the incubator separately away from your incubation bucket. We also need to make sure to bundle the NSM plates separately so they can be incubated for longer and induce endospore formation. So just a few nuances to incubation. The other thing is that there is no lecture for Lab 19, but it is a really good time, again, to go back and make sure they're understanding the data tables and they're getting good entries in those, and they're doing a nice job of thoroughly maintaining their notebook throughout this process. So that being said, I think we are ready to talk about how to go about grading this new ID plan that we've added to the assignment. It will be worth 10 points, and I've created a rubric that I will attach to the email announcing this Punctibyte that will allow you to maybe more formally grade that assignment. So let me pull that over here, and bear in mind that this is brand new, so most certainly it will need some work. We will have to see how it works for us this first time we grade the assignment, and we may end up thinking that we need to modify this rubric a little bit. For example, maybe we're going to find that we think we need to have a separate rubric, one for the gram positive and one for the gram negative. So we're just going to have to see how this works and how it goes. But let me explain the areas to you. First, in the columns, the vertical columns, we have 4 categories. Unsatisfactory means that it's lacking, it's inaccurate, it's inappropriate, it's just not fully formed. The second column over is evolving, which means that it is starting to get there, but something's not quite fully formed. So that is, it's partial. It's only part way there. It's getting there, but it isn't there yet. Competent means that it is there. Competent is a score that we're looking for. That's what we want our students to be able to accomplish, is a competent score. It's appropriate and it's accurate. But some students will give you accomplished work. That is to say that it goes a step beyond and above what they're required to do for the assignment, right? There will always be someone that goes that step beyond. So we're talking about very precise, very descriptive work. It is nuanced, it is exemplary, and that would be your sort of 100% category. So let's go through each one of the rows as well. And what I've done with this is I've just made it a learning objective. So upon successful completion of this assignment, learners will be able to determine which biochemical test should be used to enable identification of their hypothesized unknowns. So if they're accomplished in this area, they not only are the tests appropriate that they have set out to do, but care is taken to fully expound on the chosen test. Descriptions are nuanced and clear. We're only looking for competent. Appropriate biochemical tests are proposed. The identification using this test will be successful, and that is a competent mark. Now, the next category down is that they need to also, upon completing this, they will, if they were successful, they will be communicating which biochemical tests are definitive or presumptive. What I mean by that is if they have hypothesized that their unknown is Staph aureus, then they need to somewhere state that the coagulase test is their definitive test. So if they clearly state that in a nuanced way in which they fully expound upon why the coagulase test is definitive for Staph aureus, then that will earn an accomplished mark. If they just simply say that the coagulase test is definitive for Staph aureus, then that is a competent mark. And they need to do that for both of their unknowns. We may decide that the best plan is to print one of these rubrics for both the A unknown and the B unknown. We'll have to see how that will work. The next category, upon successful completion of this assignment, learners will be able to differentiate appropriate negative biochemical tests from appropriate positive biochemical tests. That is, provide both examples and non-examples. Now, let me tell you what I mean by this. They would need to say, if they were doing a gram-positive coccus that is catalase negative, Appropriate non-example would be the bile esculin slant if they have an alpha hemolytic organism. They would say that the bile esculin slant could be done, but that it would come up negative because they're predicting that they have a strep. So an appropriate positive test would be the taxose A, for example, or taxose P, for example. So differentiating between what might be an appropriate test and will be negative, the bile esculin slant, versus what might be appropriate test and is thought to be positive, the taxose P, if they've hypothesized that their unknown is Streptococcus pneumoniae. So if that kind of gives you an idea, hopefully. The last category here is draw or write a scheme that clearly shows the plan for unknown identification. This is how they're communicating to you what their plan is and showing you in a drawing what they'll plan to do. It can be in writing too, but as long as it's clear. So not only are schemes clearly presented, but they are very easy to read, succinct, highly informative. The scheme will enable easy visual identification of the unknown. And if they hit that category, then that would be considered accomplished. So let me know how you feel like this will work for grading, but I think this will be a good way to go about it. Wonderful. Let's end things off today by talking a little bit about learning theories. One of the things that you will have to do if you become an educator, and most of you are going to be educators of some type, whether that be a traditional teacher or whether that be an educator of another type, you will likely have to think about what your pedagogy is, and that is your philosophy that you take to the teaching and learning process. There are many different philosophies, beginning with those that are no longer particularly held to, such as the behaviorist theory. This dates back to, for example, the ever-famous Pavlov, where he talked about how behaviors can be conditioned. So this is the idea of conditioned behavior, where the dogs would salivate when Pavlov would ring the bells. And this idea that behavior is the manifestation of learning. And we now understand that there's far more to the learning process than simply monitoring the behavior, and that cognitivists say that we need to focus too on the inner thought. That is the process of building a scaffold of knowledge within the mind and changing and reconstructing that scaffold of knowledge. Along with cognitivism came around the idea of social cognitivism, where the individual and the environment are involved. That is to say that there are environmental factors that might contribute to how a person builds this scaffold of knowledge and changes that scaffold. And in cognitivism began this idea of the teacher as a role model. Teacher as role model is something that I hold to very strongly, and I would identify myself as a humanist. So the underpinning philosophy that is considered humanist is this idea that the learning process is very holistic. That is to say that within the learning, there is a capability for an individual to transform as a person. That is, they will change and transform if they are given the right opportunities and the right facilitation for learning. So this is a process, learning then, as a process of self-actualization, and that can be realized in part by having a good facilitator for that learning. So recognizing the learner as a whole thinking being, but also recognizing that person as not divorced from the environment. So I am certainly a humanist, but I also believe in social constructivism. That is, that environment matters to the knowledge and the reality that a learner constructs. So one person whose work is particularly meaningful to me is Carl Rogers, and he developed the idea, or at least was first to really write about the idea of pedagogy as being student-centered. That is learner-centered. That is looking at our students and basing how we teach on them. And this is something you probably pick up in my teaching. I tend to try to focus more on the student than on the content. And one of my favorite things to say is that I teach students, I don't teach microbiology. And that's something that's important to me in the pedagogy that I have. So constructivists are a group of thinkers that talk about the way in which the learner constructs meaning from that material which they're given. So the content is not divorced of the learner constructing the meaning from that content. I am a cautious constructivist, and I am more aptly a cautious social constructivist. And the reason that I say cautious is because sometimes constructivist teachers tend to err on the side of removing themselves from the process of learning. That is, they say, oh, well, my learner is going to construct whatever meaning they want from this anyway, so I might as well just remove myself from the process. And I think that is a vehicle for laziness. I think it allows a lot of professors to become very lazy by simply saying that they are constructivists. I hate that. And I think that we need to play a very active role in facilitating learning, and that when we begin to learn through dialogue and discussion, that's when some of the best learning takes place. And as Kyle will now tell you, after having done the activity that he did the other day, and I've talked to some of you about that, where he allowed the students to give the lecture. He gave them each individual slides and then allowed them to give the lecture, and he facilitated that process. And one of the things about that is that that's not easier than giving the lecture. It's actually a little bit harder. But what it does do is it enables the students to construct their knowledge while at the same time allowing you to be a part of what helps that process. So this is something to think more about and to help you define your pedagogy. It's something that if you ever apply for any position that has any component of teaching in it, whether that be a professorship or something else, you will be asked to write about your pedagogy. So with that being said, I hope you've all had a wonderful Sunday, and I'll see you very soon.